Good evening, viewers and friends of the Hyderabad Literary Festival. A very warm welcome to you all, as well as to our panelists here today, Anukriti Upadhyay and Usha Raman. This is the first session of season 2024 of HLF Online. In January, we had a fantastic annual festival, which was hugely successful because a lot of people visited it of all ages, and we had a great array of events that went into it, and it was highly appreciated. Thank you for coming and making the festival so very successful. I would like to now talk about the book that is featured today and about the author as well. This is a short story book, The Blue Women, which paints vivid portraits of people's lives as they encounter the strange and the enigmatic, whether it is other people, creatures, nature, the inanimate, or themselves. With rare insightfulness, Anukriti Upadhyay shines a light on the fractures and fears, the prejudices and wounds, and the desires and memories that inhabit the deepest recesses of her characters' psyches. Original and gripping, these are stories that will worm their way deep down into your heart and to your mind. Our guest today is Anukriti Upadhyay. She has postgraduate degrees in management and literature, and she's also a lawyer, and a graduate degree in law. She writes fiction and poetry in English and Hindi. Her English publications include Daura 2019 and Bhauri 2019, which I actually recommend because I loved both of them. They're novellas, and Kintsugi 2020, a novel. This was awarded the Sushila Devi Award for the best fiction by a woman author in 2020. She also has Hindi works which include Japani Sarai 2019, short stories, and Nina Auntie 2021. Her writings in Hindi and English have appeared in prestigious journals. She worked for global investment banks in senior positions and now works with Wildlife Conservation Trust. Usha Raman is my colleague on the core team of the Hyderabad Literary Festival, and we had a lovely team going together working towards it. She is a professor of media studies at the University of Hyderabad, where she teaches and researches in the areas of digital cultures, feminist media studies, children and media, and journalism pedagogy. She also edits a monthly magazine for school teachers called Teacher Plus and is a co-founder of FemLab, an academic activist platform. And I loved the review. She used to have a regular review column on podcasts in the Hindu called Peace in a Pod till recently. Welcome, both of you, Anukriti and Usha, to this session. And we're looking forward to an exciting conversation between both of you. Over to you, Usha.
Thank you so much, Kinera. And welcome, Anukriti, to HLF Online. This is the first online interaction since the festival, and I think it's been about a month since the live festival, and we thought we were really exhausted, but the moment there is the possibility of more literature, even if it's online, it gets us excited again, and I think you got that sense from Kinera. So we're really happy to have you here to talk about your book. And I just wanted to start off by acknowledging that, it seems that in a very short space of time, you produced a prodigious amount of work. Within about a decade or, just a little over a decade, you have several books. And I think it's remarkable that you've been writing both in Hindi and in English, at a time when so many of us are becoming monolingual. And you need a translator if you are to bring more work into English or into the other languages. I think it's really amazing that we have somebody who writes with equal felicity in both English and in Hindi. So yeah, thanks for being here. And if I could start off by asking you, it's the cliched question, but I think it would give us a good platform from which to go forward, which is, how did you start your writing career? And given that you have this very varied background in management and law and financial consulting, how is it that you decided, or maybe you didn't decide, maybe it happened, but how did it all happen?
Thank you very much for the very generous introduction, Kinera, and thank you for having me here, Usha. I was unfortunate enough to not be able to be in Hyderabad because I fell sick with a really bad viral at the time the HLF happened on ground. As to the question how I started writing and my checkered background, my favorite answer to it is I don't do anything very well, so I have to do many things in order to console myself. The more serious answer about writing, which for me is perhaps now that my son is all raised up and launched into the world, is the most serious thing I do. The thing that keeps on happening even when the actual act of writing is not happening. It's something that just is a kind of a churn, a manthan that goes on inside. I came to writing very early in life. My mother says that I used to write poetry even when I was not, I was pretty much illiterate. So you can imagine what kind of poetry I must have written. So, but I wrote Hindi poetry for a very, very long time before I came to prose, which very recent. I started writing fiction in 2016. And it's, like you said, it's just one of those things that happened at some point. Poetry felt constrained in order for me to tell the story I wanted to tell, and the transition to fiction happened. But words, books, writing were always a part of both my external world as well as my interior world. And the transition from being a reader of prose and fiction to writer of prose and fiction happened naturally. But I still consider myself a poet first, though nobody else does, unfortunately.
Yeah. So in terms of the trajectory of your writing, I mean, you've written sort of, I think, in multiple genres, if I might say. Of course, you've been described as somebody who dwells in folk tales, and somebody who believes that folk tales are a mode of truth telling in a way. Those are not the words that I read, but I think one might describe it as so. And I'm wondering how your early reading, and I know in other interviews you've spoken about your mother's influence on your writing and her, the sort of books she read and the stories she told and so on. So how is it that folk tales have become a vehicle for the kind of stories that you fashioned, particularly in English?
So whilst my English works, Dora and Bhori, have made extensive use of folktales and read in parts like folktales, the folktales in Dora and Bhori and the stories of Dora and Bhori both are just imaginary. None of them are actually folktales. But as you know, what are folktales? These are just stories that were told orally for a long time, and they've come down to us through the passage of time with permutations and combinations and so forth. So I like to think that my stories are from the folk, and to that extent folk tales, but in the traditional sense of the word, they're not really folk tales, they are imagined. The reason I chose that mode or that way, a craft, or made it part of my story craft is, I think it happens sort of organically, but now when I think back, when I try to rationalize or try to do a retrofit to see what was the reason, one definitely was that I grew up in a very folktale rich community and state. So there were folktales being told by everybody around me. My mother was a great storyteller. My father taught literature. I was raised in a house filled with books. So those early stories definitely had an influence The nomads I saw as I was growing up in Jaipur, they were definitely an influence. And the biggest reason, I think, was that folk tales have survived over over a long period of time. They were transmitted orally because we had more of an oral tradition rather than a written tradition of telling stories. They belonged largely to the women's world. Women told each
Yeah.
other stories. They tried to make their existences richer by bringing in this magic, bringing in stories that highlighted them, that put them in the center, whereas in the real world they were not in the center. They were very marginalized. um,
Mhm.
they were also a way um, to find justification for their marginalized position. You know, they made a mistake in keeping a fast or observing a festival, and that's why all this happened. So I felt they were very much a woman's tool to tell their stories, to find rationale, to keep alive the love of literature, connection with arts in their lives. So I guess a multitude of reasons. And I just loved reading and listening to folk tales. So I hope, that love passed through my writing to others as well.
So, I mean, we will come to talk about your newest book, but I wanted to talk a bit more about context. And across your writing, and this is something you yourself seem to have observed, that the English stories, Bhauri and Dora, and some of the stories in the Blue Book, for instance, in the Blue Women, um, are situated in, of course, the Blue Women is more urban, but the other two stories are situated in a rural landscape and take on more of the folktale aspect of storytelling, or parts of them do. Whereas your Hindi writing, as you yourself have observed, tend to be more cosmopolitan, more situated in urban contexts. And in some ways, that's a reversal of expectation, right? We tend to expect English writing in English to be urban, and writing in other languages to be more rural. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Um, so you're right. It has been a bit of a puzzle for me too. Why I chose to write Dora, Bhauri, and Kintsugi. Though Kintsugi is urban in the sense that it's situated in Jaipur, in the jewelry market of Jaipur and Japan. But one could argue that the jewelry market of Japan of Jaipur is very vernacular. It's like Rajasthani Hindi. Um, perhaps when I first writing fiction, and I initially wrote fiction in English. I started writing prose in Hindi, maybe a year later. But when I first started writing fiction, all those early memories, um, things that children imagine, all those early influences just bubbled through the writing by itself. And it seems that the early influences, though I grew up in an urban landscape of Jaipur, but Jaipur stood at the cusp of that rural urban place when I was growing up. So perhaps those early influences just transited into fiction. And because I began writing fiction in English, because I was living very much in a world that communicated in English, that was the only language people could speak across countries and understand across countries. And I worked for in an international corporate environment. So the fiction or prose happened in English, and my old memories just passed through them. When I started writing in Hindi, I realized I have more contemporary things to say, and they found. So, for example, Nina Auntie, which is a short novel in Hindi, is a very urban story of an older woman who's raised in Jaipur. She grew up in the late 60s, 70s, and her life. She's a very unconventional woman. It just came in Hindi. It was as if the language chose the story by itself, and I have tried to sort of unravel the organic process of how language and stories like fit together, but they just defy me. They just happen the way they do.
So from what you're saying, it seems like it's not a conscious choice. The story emerges in one language or another. Is that how it is?
Absolutely.
Or
You
do you
put it so much
decide?
better
Okay.
than me.
Yeah. So I'm also wondering, again, you've described yourself as a self-taught writer. And I would argue that every writer is in a way self-taught, right? I mean, okay, you may try to imitate or you may try to fashion your phraseology after a certain person you admire, but eventually you have to learn your own craft. And so I'm wondering how you see yourself, in this marketplace today, where there's so much new writing in English and in all languages, of course. And lineage seems to be, and network seems to be very important to emerge as a writer. So to be a self-taught or a self-positioned writer, what does that mean in today's world?
That's a very interesting question. And you've been asking such interesting questions. They're really making my brain cells like really resonate with activity. I can't. So I don't see. First of all, I don't see myself as a writer in a marketplace simply because and I mean it in all humility. I have done nothing that is sort of praiseworthy or admirable in the writing field. I just try to tell the stories that have come to me. But I see myself as a very solitary writer who just wants to write. I write because at this point in my life, this is what I need to do. So I don't see myself in a marketplace, and it's a function of many things because I have been in a marketplace for 22 years working as a finance professional in investment banks, and I have striven in that marketplace, and I like to tell myself that I flourished. So now that I've come to writing, I have come to a place of peace. Um, Externally, everything is quiet. I'm not in the market. I do not network. I know very few people, and hardly anybody knows me. I write in a space where I do not believe I'm competing with anyone, and in all humility, all I want to do is write the best I can. So for me, the marketplace is a marketplace of one person. That's me. I write for myself, and I write really just competing with myself, trying to distill into words exactly what I have conceived in my head. And time and again I fail, but I don't give up trying. um, I don't know. I don't know where literary fiction as a genre. I mean, I've told I write literary fiction because I had no clue when my editor picked up the books to publish through a cold submission. I just sent the manuscripts to the slush pile, and I was like really fortunate to have an excellent editor like Rahul Soni pick up those books, and he said, "Oh, we'll publish them under Fourth Estate, which is our literary fiction imprint." I realized I was writing literary fiction because from the way I see it is I'm writing stories. If the stories I'm writing are speaking to you, are making their way to people, even if it's one person, even if it's one individual to whom they say something or for whom they open a door or solve a puzzle, my writing arc is complete. That's all I need. One person to read it and say, "This is my story."
Yeah, well, clearly many more people have read it. More than one person has read your story. So I don't think of course, it's a great way to approach storytelling, that, you really want to write for yourself. You want the stories to come out because they're in you. And whether there is a reader or not, of course, you hope there are readers. That's not the point. The point is to tell the story. So I think that's a very good attitude for a writer to have. So if we could come to the book, and of course I have more questions for you on, generally on writing and your writing life, but just to talk a little bit about this book, right? The Blue Women. I picked it up because I was introduced to your writing through HLF. And again, like I said, there's so many new books coming out and so many authors that are being introduced to you. So you really don't know, you have no expectations when you come to a new work. And so I must tell you that the 12 stories in the book, I liked some more than others, but there's such a range. And to people who are listening and watching, if you read the first story and you think, oh, the others are going to be the same, you will be completely surprised, because each one, I think, comes from a very different place and deals with a very different kind of situation. So this is your first book of short stories, right? After the novellas. Am I right?
In English. In English, yes.
In English. Okay. Yeah. So how did you come to this form, and how did this particular book emerge?
So short stories have always been my favorite form of writing. The challenge of it, the relatively short span in which they crystallize and emerge, the freedom they provide in the sense that you can explore one thing, and that one thing you can just completely focus on that one thing. The constraint that you cannot be diffused, all that makes up for an interesting kind of form of narrative fiction. So I initially started writing short stories. Dora, which then became a short novel, started its life as a 10,000 word long story. So I wrote short stories on the longer end of the of the scale, and then I realized that it just grew and turned into what it was, with the very expert feedback that I got from my editor, who read it and was very generous to share his views. So short stories came to me as the first way of just like getting the words, getting that story out there. Novels or short novels came afterwards. Um, I felt that I felt that I grappled with this form, like I grappled with the craft of short story, the plots, in bouts, and I came out worsted after every bout, but energized to go again. Yeah, I don't mind. I'm on the ropes, but up I get. So, the stories that you see in the Blue Women are, interestingly, they are from they are chosen from across a longish bit. So I started writing fiction in 2016. Started writing seriously and started working on my craft. And the stories you see in the Blue Women range from the ones I wrote in 2016, 17, 18, 19, right up till 22. So they are sort of almost like a showcase of every bout I fought with the short story form, and they were selected by my editor Rahul Soni and Renita Banerjee, and my publisher Udin at HarperCollins. And it was, they didn't know when the stories were written, because I never dated them in the manuscript I sent them. And they just happened to pick those stories. So the Blue Women, for example, the title story, is amongst a batch of, I think, 5 or 6 short stories I wrote way back in 16. They were just the initial story. And the Queen of Mahim and the Satsuma tree, the Satsuma plant, are from 21 and 22. So they just organically picked up those stories, and I was surprised that they did so. So I think every time I wrote, bunches of short stories, at least they felt there was one which was worth a greater sort of readership.
Yeah, because I mean, that explains in a way the range of subjects and the treatment as well. I mean, they vary quite a bit in treatment. And I'm wondering how, in some ways, they seem to me, I mean, of course, many of them are told from the perspective of women, but many are told through a male gaze. And that's also interesting, right? So to figure out what is the, the gender viewpoint of the narrator, it takes a little bit of time. You don't immediately give it out. And then it's interesting to go back and see how your view changes if the narrator is a man and if the narrator is, identifies as a woman. And I'm wondering how that sort of game with the short story form that you played, how did that work? Because it's always a challenge to, I mean, of course, as a writer, you want to be able to speak in multiple voices. But how did you make the choice? For instance, the one story I'd like to refer to, which is Made in Heaven, which is very much about the woman, but it's told from the perspective of the man, which is an interesting contrast. And so could you talk a little bit about that? And maybe you should say what that story is about, because many of our audience may not have read the book.
Sure. So in brief, Made in Heaven is about a man who finds his wife in mortal danger and then discovers many new things about her. So the reason why this story is told from in a male voice or through the male gaze, perhaps. So firstly, when I'm writing the story, I don't consciously decide, but I'm sure every time we do anything creative, there is a big subconscious churn, big it's just activity that is not apparent to us, because then the cognitive stress of trying to balance what's where the motivation comes from and where the execution is happening, that would be too much, I guess. So happily, that internal sort of reasoning at the time of writing the first draft is unavailable to me. It's not accessible. But after I've written and worked and reworked, it emerges that there was there was a very distinctive reason, and everything about the story was with a purpose or a motive. So I guess the reason why Made in Heaven is told from the perspective of men, to put it very simplistically, because of the male blindness when it comes to women existing in a relationship framework. The inability or the lack of will or interest to penetrate beyond the relationship to the individual, to see the person steadily and see her whole, to brutalize Ian Forster, but to do that is somehow difficult for men. And I wanted to bring that out, the fact that you can spend all your life, which all of us know actually, if you distill it down the reasoning, it's seems very trite. All of us know that we can never know the other person fully, or even a little bit. We probably just scratch the surface, even if we spend a lot of time with them or spend our lives with them. However, that sort of limitation seems to be a feature found more in on the male side in the relationship, and probably that's where Made in Heaven came from, and was tongue in cheek on marriage, and just turned quite dire when I was writing. It didn't start out as that, but Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, very well. And I'm also thinking, I mean, again, as a writer who's a woman, and also you've spoken about feminism and feminist writing in other contexts. In some ways, on reading the stories, you see that it is a lot about female agency, even within constrained circumstances. So the title story, for instance, "The Blue Women," is about a strong woman occupying a role that often people dismiss as a constrained choice. And so yes, so how do you, and if I don't want to label your politics in any way, but if I were to use, because I'm an academic, use a term like your feminist politics, how do they inform your writing? Again, is it that the stories, it's because of your politics that the stories take on a certain character, or yeah, so how does that work?
So, I mean, there's no denying the fact that being a woman who exists in a world where the role, the gender, everything conspires to constrict our presence. I am a feminist, and I have a feminist politics, feminist view. I view things through feminist texts. I've tried to educate myself consciously, because I never had the chance to academically go into those texts, but I try to educate myself as I learned to find my way in this world. I wrote a poem in Hindi not very long ago, which is "Ab stri hona hi meri siyasat hai," which, literally translated means being a woman is my politics. The very fact that I am a woman is a political statement. I am who I am, not as a person first, but my gender first. That makes it political immediately, because I'm never recognized as an individual, but my gender seems to walk into the room ahead of me, and I'm always grappling with it. I'm always either trying to embrace it and and actualize myself in that gender, or I'm trying to push it away and trying to be somebody else, or I'm striving. And it is a thing, striving, friction, conflict is where all kinds of creative impulses come from. So for sure, my writing emerges from this, from my gender and from the world. There's a lot of friction between the two, unfortunately. However, I can truthfully say that when I'm writing, I do not write from a political perspective. I just want to tell the story. If the story is political, so be it. If it's read as political, so be it. If it is criticized for being political, well, yeah, I take it. However, I do not choose to write from a political standpoint. And I always try to winkle myself out from my writing. I do not want to be present in my writing. I don't want to mediate between the story and the reader any more than I already have to. So I keep using this motive. I consider myself as the midwife who brings forth, makes the birth happen, and then passes on the baby. So midwife has a very functional role. She's there to aid on both sides, to aid the mother's pains and to aid the baby's passage. But she is neutral. She has no, or she should not have, interference or intermediation. So I try very hard to take myself out. However, if the story is such that it brings forth these issues of agency or issues of constraints, then I'm not to be blamed or credited.
No, no, I think you do a disservice to your role there, right? I mean, of course, a midwife is expected to be disinterested, but equally interested in the outcome of both the mother and the baby. So in that sense, it's very difficult to remove the quality that she brings to the passage of from one place to another. So again, talking about the women in the story, they could be, especially Made in Heaven really touched me because it's a situation so many women find themselves in, right? The choices they make at different points in life and how ordinary they are made to seem, but then how deeply they actually impact the psyche of the women. And most lives just pass without that being recognized. And then you find that, playing itself out in different ways in the other stories as well. So you can't but notice it. And again, in terms of the stories in the book, some of them are a deep look at a single moment, and some of them span, a long space of time. And how do you, approach that? I mean, do you like to look into a moment deeply? Maybe this is a kind of facile question because as a writer, you want to do everything. But what would be your favorite way of bringing forth a story?
So usually for me, stories start from either a visual image. So for example, Janki and the bat. The story, I as literal as that, saw this beautiful, magnificent people tree, and the bats hanging all over it, like some kind of grotesque chandelier, like all these, from the lowest branch to the topmost, there are all these bats, like somebody has decorated the tree for Halloween. And that was the visual. From that visual, somehow came this girl, Janki, and her connection with this bat. So most often it's visual. Sometimes it's a set of words which seem too interesting to not delve into further, to find out like why this line, what happened for it to emerge this way. So if you almost always, if I look back, the stories are an incident in the present, and then they go back and back and back and forth. So I think what I attempt to do in almost every short story is to investigate that one moment. But in order to investigate that one moment, motivations and transitions and context has to be figured. And that's how I guess the stories come about. So, for example, Shawarma, which is a very urban story again, set in Hong Kong, two colleagues in a very corporate environment. The story is all happening in that moment. But, how did that moment come to pass? It came to pass through past experience and past intersections and encounters and memories. So, so the attempt always is that one moment.
Mm-hmm. And also, talking about, shawarma is one kind of story. And then there's another one, I'm trying to remember the name, where this young couple is in a restaurant, Dhani. And there's not always a resolution. It seems like you're often leaving the reader to imagine the rest of the story. And particularly in Dhani, for instance, and in some of the other stories, there are these non-human characters, right? There are, like in Dhani, it's the frogs, and in another, it's the bat, like you said, or the ants. And I'll come back to the ant. I have a specific question around that. So there are these, other beings that play a role in the story, but you're never quite sure what they stand for. So you're not being explicit about it. You leave the reader to imagine. So again, is that something you would like to explain a little bit? Or do you not
Sure.
want to? Completely up to you. Yeah.
I have a view as a writer. Um, you have a view as a very erudite academic reader. Others, if anybody else has read these stories, have their own views. I'm happy to share my view. But like I always say, I was just the one telling the story. What do I know about its full meaning? The full meaning is not formed till the reader reads it and brings their own internalized memories, their imagination, everything inside to the table.
Mhm.
But to go back to Dhani, you do know that there are like tiny frogs, right? I've seen tiny frogs, and they are most fascinating. They're like perfectly formed miniatures, and but when I wrote the story, I hadn't seen the frog. Afterwards, subsequently, I saw a really tiny frog on a sidewalk in Singapore, which, despite being such a concrete jungle, has so many trees and a lot of natural life. So, so specifically about Dhani, the frogs, of course, are a metaphor for all the unseen issues that are small, but they are slippery and they make you uncomfortable. They might repulse you at some time, but they're always weighing on you, and they are too numerous to deal with. And for that reason, some people just choose not to look at them, like Dhani's husband. And some people are acutely aware of them, like Dhani. So, so that was the thought behind those tiny frogs. I love frogs. I think they're very, very interesting creatures. Um, as to the natural, other kind of animals or creatures which come into my story, that's because I find animals and nature deeply fascinating. I feel everything they do is natural and simplistic. We do the same things. However, those same things just assume this complexity and this entangled quality and fraught with conflicts and struggles which are difficult to explain. So I find the natural world and the human world such polar opposites of each other, and that definitely informs my writing. Definitely comes through every time I start writing. At some point, some creature pops up. This is inevitable. I have tried to curb it. I've tried to tell myself, by do not adopt it as a crutch. Every time something complex is happening, do not allow a creature in. But I can't help it. That if the creature is already in before I know what's happening. So I take no responsibility. It's the way they emerge out of the woodworks and just take me by surprise too. But on the other hand, I do spend a lot of time, or try to spend a lot of time, just in the nature, just observing and absorbing what I see. And like all of us, these things seep into our lived lives, seep into everything else we do. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love the way they creep into your writing or jump into your writing. And, for again, for our viewers, I think there's this lovely short story that I found of yours in Cosmopolitan, I think. And the last line is just so beautiful about this little girl who wants to be an ant. And this older woman shows her how to become an ant by quietly slipping away, or as a petal, turning into a petal and slipping away. And that was just such a beautiful image. And it's a really short story, but now, as I'm talking to you, it reminded me so much of some of the quality of the longer pieces in this book, because it's the unexpectedness of some of them. It really takes you by surprise. And also issues of the internal life, right? I mean, I mean, maybe you don't want to put a heavy term on it like mental health, but I think that does, and more explicitly in some of the stories and less so in others. And so yeah, so clearly this book, and I have to go back and read all your other work, but in this book, there's just such a range of stories that, I have to thank you for writing them. But I'd like to come back to craft for a little bit before Kinera tells us that time is up. And, as a professional, who had many years in the corporate world, etc., did you, when you started writing, was it after you had made time for yourself, or did you, how did you take on or create the writerly life for yourself?
So I actually wrote while working full time till end of 2019. Then I finally quit the employed class and just decided to turn into an unemployable person because I live too much in words now, too much in books, and I find myself drawing farther and farther away from concrete life in which I was firmly embedded. So as a lawyer working for international investment banks, I did a certain kind of work which established me at the center of the capitalist world we all live in. And then in 19, I decided for a variety of reasons to quit. But till then, so from 16 to 19, I wrote while I worked full time. I wrote mostly at night when everybody was asleep and there was peace and quiet and everything. Since 19, again, for a variety of reasons, I had a lot of traveling. I wrote sitting in the airport lounges or just, in a moving vehicle or stuff like that. So I don't know whether you would say I lead a writerly life. I do find myself now increasingly standing apart and observing, which I guess is part of a writerly life. I feel very fortunate that I worked in a certain kind of in a certain industry, in a certain kind of role, which now allows me the leisure to step aside and and choose to not work in a salaried position, not work in a way that takes away a lot of my time and all of my mental space. So to that extent, yes, I lead a far more writerly life, or as my son puts it, I am dabbling in my hobbies. I'm living for my hobbies.
When you've written as many books as you have, I wouldn't call it dabbling. So, I think we need to educate our children sometimes, as we were saying before we started.
You are so kind. You're so kind.
No, I'm in the same position. My children would also think my passions are my hobbies. So I feel you. So I see Kinera's on the screen, and she probably has questions from the audience that she'd like to raise. So over to you, Kinera. But before you start, I just wanted to say, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this delightful conversation. So it didn't feel like a Q&A.
I hope I didn't cut off any of the other questions you had, Usha.
No, I'm fine. Okay. There will always be questions, but that's good.
Okay. There are a few questions. I'll start with Akanksha Abhismuta's questions. She asked two, but actually there are four, I think. How do you choose the narration for the stories? Do you consciously choose first or third person narrator? That's the first question. I think I'll go one by one. Yeah.
Sure. Hi, Akanksha. Akanksha has been very generous about my work, and I'm grateful to you, Akanksha, for reading them with so much sympathy. How do I choose the narration? So I don't choose it consciously, but maybe at a subconscious level it works. Sometimes and that I've only become aware when I am trying to like refine, edit, re-edit, tinker, or trash whatever I've written, that perhaps certain voice works better to put more distance, certain voice works better to show the nature of the subject matter. So for example, the blue women, I think I chose the the perspective of the male narrator to focus on a female life, on a female character, um, all the differences of class, gender, prejudices. I thought they were best brought out through the male perspective, but that was not the thought I had while I was writing. So whenever I try to explain why I wrote something, I'm actually retrofitting. Like, okay, I wrote this. What was the reason? So your guess is as good as mine. If you think that a story does not work in the voice it is written, do let me know, and I will rework it. I love to rework my older stuff.
In the Blue Women, she particularly asks, how do you decide which story should be a conversation and which not?
How do I decide? So uh, some stories are just, they need two people. They need to be depopulated. The world outside should be a backdrop, like a curtain, painted curtain. And for those stories to happen. So the blue woman, they are in a closed space and captive audience, captive storyteller, or the big toe, a crowded space, but two people, and activity all around, or like Dhani, three people. So some of those stories just demand a setting where, in order for the story to work, i.e., one person um, to assume the role of the teller rather than the story actually unfolding in real time, that kind of listener and told setting works. Also, now that I'm speaking about it, maybe it just harks back to my love for folk tales, because in folk tales that's what happens, right? There's a teller, there's a listener, and in Rajasthani we say, there's a teller, there's a listener, and there's somebody up there, keeping the story cycle going. Um, so maybe it's the reason is also my sort of my engagement with folk tales, my fascination with them. Yeah, I guess that's the reason.
Actually, Kinera, if you
Yeah.
before you move to the next question, if I could just jump on with a small, additional question related to that. The character of the narrator is also interesting, right? And like you said, in the Blue Women, he's inquisitive. He pushes her to tell him the story, whereas in the other story, Dhani, for instance, he's hesitant, and they want to tell the story. So that's an interesting decision as well, right? So could you talk a little bit about that? Sorry, Kinera, to interrupt. Yeah.
No problem at all.
What a fascinating question that is, Usha. Yes, you're right. There's a reason why the character has certain personality. So in Blue Woman, there is a lot of to use like a term which probably is not really fitting, but magical reality. A lot of stuff happening which is inexplicable, and for that to unfold, the person, the listener, should be inquisitive. Yeah, why did it happen, and how did it happen? In Dhani, where there is a lot of emotional tension, not so many things are happening, but there is an emotional intensity. In order for that intensity to be highlighted, the narrator has to stand, he acts as a foil. He's the he's the person who frankly cannot care less. Actually, he's curious, but still can't care less. That kind of person, that person who is drawn reluctantly into that situation for that emotional sort of crisis to become more striking. um, Probably that's the reason.
Okay. Akanksha has two more questions, but I think I'll ask them in alternate, with other questions as well. There's Dr. D. Ramakrishna, who says, any writing, I assume, emerges from the emotions, perspectives, or learning of a writer. Is it possible for the writer to be completely detached from his or her literary work? I think this you did talk about it, and I think there's a question on that particular response of yours.
Sure. I can honestly say I'm completely detached to towards my work, because I think attachment comes from preference or partiality, or if the thing is worth attaching yourself to. I don't think I've written anything till now that I should be possessive about or feel attached to. Maybe if I do manage to write something like that, I feel is, this is what I was meant to write. This is how I was meant to write. This is the best way I could have told the story. Then I would probably become attached too. But yes, it's completely possible for a writer to be detached. I can honestly say that um, I do not prefer one story over other. I do not, I do not, um, I actually do not mind when people criticize my work. I'm keen to hear criticism so that I can better my craft. I forget the stories I've written, because short story is something I constantly am writing. I'm always writing too at any given point of time. So in fact, when Usha mentioned that story about a girl who wants to be an ant and many different things, I had completely forgotten that I had written that story. In short, yes, it is possible. I also think it's healthy. Just the way we allow our children, or we should allow our children to to exist beyond, away from us, be their own selves, be who they were meant to be. So should the stories, except that our children have a visceral hold on us. The whole nurture, emergence, bloodline, all that primal, um, it- genetically coded love, as we call it, it comes into play, and we cannot let go our children. And I, as a mother, I cannot let go my child, but I try to let go of my stories. Here, I've written them now. Go out in the world, fend for yourself. Cannot look out for you anymore.
Yeah. My colleague Vijay Kumar asks, does the idea of a story come first and then you choose the language, or do they come in a particular language? Is having two languages a resource or a dilemma?
First of all, I just want to say hello to Professor Vijay Kumar. I'm very grateful that you invited me for the Lit Fest, and extremely sad. It was all my loss that I couldn't be there because of sickness. So on your question, whether the story and the language, whether one of those come first, I can honestly say that the story emerges in a particular language. It just that it's almost as if the story and the language are conjoined in my mental space, and then when they come out, this is the story and this is the language. This is to be told in. But as Ghalib said, "Aate hain ghaib se ye mazameen khayal mein." All these stories and the telling of them come from this other dimension that I cannot access, but my stories seem to be able to, access all the time. So, yeah, the short answer is they're always together.
Our friend Sarla Mahidhara asks, first she makes a statement and then she asks a question. There is a curious explorative aspect to her imaginative writing, especially in Dora. For example, of a somewhat romantically surreal type, and the story of the female taxi driver who gets visions of her passengers in danger. I would like her to comment on this aspect. Is there a special message in the fact that the taxi driver decides to start working at night?
First of all, I want to thank Sarla for introducing me to the wonderful Hyderabad Lit Fest team, and also for reading so many of my works, inept, faltering as they are. Thank you very much for being so kind and generous towards them, Sarala. Um, your question is whether these sort of magical surrealism that is a conscious choice, or there's an aspect of agency on my part, like I'm choosing to put these things into the stories, or the stories draw them out. Um, I would like to say that the stories draw them out, but also because I enjoy myself the most when I'm writing those kind of things which are not rational, because because all our lives are rational. We are rooted in the places, in our bodies, in our relationships, and that's how we spend our all lives, like in these frameworks in which they are meant for us to thrive, I hope, but they also hold us back. So in my stories, I love to do this exploration. I want to see if there were no constraints, what could happen. And sometimes it's utter chaos, but at other times it's fun. Does it answer a question? I am not entirely sure.
Well, I have another question from Vijay. Have you ever tried to translate any of your stories from one language to the other?
Oh yes, all the time. I love to tinker with the languages. I don't call it translation. It's more like transformation, or transmutation. And every time I take a story and in one language and write it in another language, there are changes. There are changes to the extent that the stories start becoming like different stories. So I do that. I feel that the more languages we have access to, the more layers of our own motivations, our own selves, the external world, um, the magic of this whole improbable, fallible universe that we are part of, that whole magic becomes in many ways deeper, but in many other ways more accessible. The more you go deep, the more languages with which you can play, the more words you have to describe that magic, that depth. So yeah, I try to do that.
I'll go back to Akanksha's questions. Are your women inspired by Manu Bhandari's women? Are there writers who particularly influence you?
No, my women are not inspired by Manu Bhandari's women. I wouldn't put my work in the same room as Manuji's. Um, she is a writer because writers never die. They all these children that they've brought in the world, like they ensure that the writer lives on. So even though Manuji is not with us physically, and I never knew her personally, I know all her writings, and I grew up reading them. I grew up reading a lot of the 60s and 70s Hindi authors, a lot of a certain kind of English literature, the colonial literature, which was the staple diet of all of us. Um, I hope my writing is inspired by everything I have read, everything I have seen, everything I have lived. But I also hope that my writing stands apart from all this. I do not want my experience, my feelings, my thoughts in my writings. I literally want to be, the medium through which things pass and then they distill out. Um, so no, I don't think my women characters are inspired by Manu Bhandari's, but she wrote some strong, vibrant, dynamic, iconoclastic women characters, which gave me a lot of hope as a young woman when I was, and as a teenager when I was reading them.
I think this would be the final question, again from Akanksha. There are so many ways that your characters have dealt with loneliness, grief, power, and agency. How does that happen to not repeat a certain way of dealing with, let's say, loss? I think there's a good question.
It's a very good question and a big compliment if you think that I've not um, repeated myself. You know how there's a poem by a gay which I love quoting. It's called. It goes like this. It's a short poem. It says, "Dukh sabko manjta hai, और चाहे जिन्हें वो मांझता है उन्हें मुक्त करना वो न जाने, लेकिन उन्हें सिखाता है सबको मुक्त रहना." So grief refines us and teaches us to set everything free. And I think when things are refined, when you start reducing, distilling, different things emerge. And all different personalities intersect differently with grief at points of time, and how we react to it, how we process it, how we express it, or do not express it, internalize it, or externalize it, depends upon the circumstances, the time, the grief itself, who we are, what we are allowed to do. And humans have such wide variety, which is why there are so many writers, painters, poets, you name them, who are all trying to grind out what humanity means, what we are capable of, what we are incapable of. So it is not very surprising that grief and loss and loneliness and everything that ails us or inflicts us or energizes our creativity comes out differently every time you try to tell it. It's like a folktale again. I'm sorry, I keep going back to the folktales. Every time they are told, there's this little twist, a fact is dropped, a scene is added, there are new songs, there are new meanings, new characters. So yeah, that's how it works. It
was very, very nice. Thank you so much. In fact, ever since I read Bhauri and the Aura, I've been wanting to feature you in HLF, so I'm so happy it happened now. It had to happen. It happened now, I think. It was wonderful conversing with you, and I loved all the insights. I love the characterization of the women in your stories and in the books, so I love them. Thank you so much for answering all the questions patiently too. And each question you have answered. And I would also like to thank Usha for, as usual, always very beautifully steering the conversation and getting you to talk. So bringing out all the issues right from the genre till the inspiration and everything. It was very, very wonderfully done. Thank you so much for a lovely conversation. I enjoyed every moment of it. And we hope that sometime you'll come to HLF with your new book. Looking forward to it.
With the next book.
Yeah, with the next book. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
guys,
viewers,
it was so
for asking the
wonderful.
question.
I was just saying thank you so much for having me over, for opening this platform for me. And thank you very much to everyone who's asked questions. And yeah, I do hope to be at HLF at some point.
Sure. Thank you very much to everyone for having watched this. And this still will be available as a recording on our YouTube channel. Not only this, we are also uploading some of the festival videos as well. So please keep watching this space. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.